Tell me again how a self-made millionaire forgets to pay off a 1.2 million debt, I asked, my voice cutting through the stunned silence of the auditorium as I walked across the stage, the thick manila folder clutched in my hand. The spotlights, which had been basking him in glory just seconds earlier, now swung half toward me, revealing every tight muscle in his jaw as the audience turned. He froze in his tailored suit, microphone halfway to his lips, the perfect image of a man suddenly exposed. The applause had stopped dead. All that remained was the faint hiss of the PA system and the rustle of paper as I spread the bill across the podium for everyone to see. His face drained of color. My heart thundered. The reckoning had arrived. It hadn't started with the stage or the lights or the headline crowd of starry-eyed entrepreneurs eager to worship at his feet. It had started much earlier, long before his face was plastered on the covers of business magazines, long before his name became a brand, and long before I realized that people could build entire empires on lies they hadn't yet been forced to pay for. Back then, he was just Martin Kessler from my neighborhood, a tall, smooth-talking son of a used car dealer who'd learned early how to weaponize a smile. He wasn't particularly bright in school, but he knew how to charm teachers out of late assignments, how to make himself look like he belonged wherever he went. My father used to mutter about him at the kitchen table. "That boy will either end up in jail or selling half the town a car they don't need," Dad said once, shaking his head as Martin strutted past our porch in his knockoff leather jacket. But jail never came. The selling did. The first real time Martin caught my attention was during college. He hadn't even finished his degree, but he was already boasting about his startup, a vague consulting firm that seemed to exist only in his imagination. What it actually was, I later found out, was him scraping together loans and favors, leaving behind IOUs dressed up as business investments. He invited me to coffee once, back when I was still naive enough to think we were friends. "You're smart, you know numbers," he said, stirring his espresso as if we were equals. "I could use a guy like you on my team. I've got something big coming." I laughed. "What team? You don't even have an office." He leaned forward, grin flashing like a switchblade. "That's the thing, man. Offices are for people who can't get others to believe in them. I don't need walls. I need believers." I should have walked then. But I didn't. I had my own bills piling up, and the promise of money, any money, sounded better than nothing. So when he asked me to help him balance his accounts for what he called a bridge deal, I agreed. That bridge deal turned out to be a set of falsified invoices for a contractor he de-stiffed. He swore up and down that it was temporary, that once his cash flow evened out, he'd pay everyone back. "It's just optics," he said, smiling like he was sharing a secret. "You have to look rich before you become rich." I remember staring at him, wondering if he actually believed his own words. It spiraled from there. Martin collected investors like stray coins, always promising the next big return. He drove cars leased under other people's names. He dined at restaurants where the bills went unpaid until months later. And then one day, he stumbled into a deal that actually did hit, a real estate flip that netted him close to $500,000. That was the moment he stopped being Martin Kessler, hustler from the block. That was when he began to believe his own mythology. Self-made, he started calling himself over and over until even the magazines repeated it like gospel. I watched from the sidelines, sick to my stomach, as he grew richer off loans he never fully repaid, debts he buried under layers of shell companies' names and signatures. People cheered him on because they wanted to believe in the fairy tale. The boy from nowhere who made himself into something, except I knew the truth. The truth came to me in fragments at first. Late-night calls from creditors who somehow had my number, old business associates who remembered I'd once handled his books, contractors furious over missing payments. Each one left me with another piece of paper, another bill, another sum he owed. It wasn't IT until I stacked them all together that I saw the total $1.2 million scattered across so many lives he'd stepped on to climb higher. I confronted him once, years before the stage, in a quiet bar on a Tuesday night. "You're drowning in debt," I told him, sliding a photocopy of one of the bills across the table. Martin barely glanced at it. He sipped his whiskey, leaned back, and smirked. "Debts are just stepping stones, my friend. People forget who they're owed once they're dazzled by success." "They haven't forgotten," I snapped. "They're still calling me." "Then maybe you should change your number." That was Martin. Always a joke, always a shrug. The debts didn't matter because the image was intact, and in his world, image was everything. So when I heard he was headlining a business conference billed as a self-made millionaire, I knew what I had to do. I didn't buy a ticket. I requested a press pass under the name of a small online journal I sometimes freelanced for. I packed every invoice, every unpaid bill, every scrap of evidence into a folder so thick it barely fit in my briefcase. The night of the conference, the auditorium was electric. Young hopefuls filled the seats, their eyes wide with dreams of becoming the next Martin Kessler. He strutted out in his $1,000 suit, grinning as the crowd roared. He began his speech with all the usual lines. How he started with nothing, how he pulled himself up by his bootstraps. They ate it up, and then I walked on stage. "You call yourself self-made?" I said, holding up the folder. My voice didn't shake. "Here's the 1.2 million worth of people who made you." Gasps rippled through the audience. Some booed, not at me, but at him. Martin's smile faltered, his practiced words evaporating. For the first time in years, I saw something I thought he'd forgotten how to feel. Fear. And that was only the beginning. He reached for the microphone like a drowning man grabbing for a rope, his voice straining to recover its familiar rhythm. "Folks, don't listen to this," he stammered, laughter wobbling at the edges. "Every successful man has people jealous of him. This is just noise. It's desperate slander." But I didn't let him. I strode closer, slapped the folder onto the podium with a crack that echoed through the speakers. Pages spilled out, sliding across the polished stage floor. Utility bills, contractor invoices, bank demands, all bearing his name, his signature, his lies. The projector, still on, caught the fluttering pages in the light, casting oversized shadows of numbers and legal seals across the massive screen behind him. "You think they're jealous?" I shouted over the sudden roar of voices. "Tell that to the single mother you owe $35,000 for a renovation job you never paid for. Tell that to the 3 investors you strung along until they lost their homes. Tell that to the bank you owe $500,000 to." The audience erupted, some gasping, others yelling, phones lifted like 1,000 tiny judgmental eyes, recording every word, every flicker of Martin's breaking composure. He snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." His polished mask cracked, the veins in his neck rising. "Those were business agreements, risks they took. Nobody forced them." "Business agreements?" I barked. "You forged receipts, Martin. You lied about profits. You built your empire on their backs, and you dare call yourself self-made." The moderator, pale and sweating, tried to cut the mic, but it was too late. The phones had captured everything, and the crowd wasn't about to let it end. The chant started from the back, faint at first but swelling. "Pay them back! Pay them back!" Martin's eyes darted wildly. The predator turned prey. His practiced confidence evaporated under the weight of hundreds of glaring faces. The truth pressed down on him like a collapsing ceiling. He dropped the mic, the screech of feedback cutting through the chaos, and stormed toward the wings of the stage. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I followed him off stage, through the narrow hallway lined with security guards frozen in confusion. "Running already?" I called after him. My voice carried down the corridor, sharp and merciless. "That's the only thing you've ever been good at." He spun around, face contorted, eyes wild. You think this ends me? You think one night, one stunt, undoes everything I've built? Not one night, I said, stepping closer, my hand gripping the edge of the folder. But the lawsuits that follow, the headlines tomorrow, the banks that will come knocking, they'll do the rest. For a flicker of a moment, he faltered. His chest heaved, and the great Martin Kessler, self-made millionaire, looked like nothing more than a scared boy in a borrowed suit. Then his shoulders squared, the mask snapping back into place. "You'll regret this," he spat, shoving past me toward the exit. But the cameras were already there, swarming, flashes popping like gunfire. Reporters thrust microphones into his face, pelting him with questions about fraud, about unpaid debts, about the evidence that had just exploded across the conference stage. He shoved through them, but his words, lies, slander, jealousy, sounded hollow now, pitiful even, drowned beneath the roar of truth. I stood back, watching, the folder still in my hands. For years he had lived untouchable, wrapped in the armor of charm and lies. But tonight, the armor cracked, and once the first crack appears, it only widens. Later, outside in the cool night air, I saw the crowds dispersing, buzzing with outrage and disbelief. Strangers approached me, thanking me, pressing my hand, asking if the documents were real. Every word, I told them, and I meant it. But as I walked away, the weight of it all settled on me. I knew this wasn't over. Martin Kessler wasn't the type to vanish quietly. He'd claw, he'd fight, he'd try to twist the story into another performance. But for the first time in his life, he was on defense, and I was ready for whatever came next. Because I hadn't just brought the bills. I had the receipts, the emails, the forged contracts, the testimonies, and soon the whole world would see what kind of self-made man he truly was. The war had only begun. The fallout came faster than even I expected. By the next morning, Martin's face was plastered across every news outlet, not with the glowing headlines he was used to. No visionary entrepreneur or rags-to-riches fairy tale this time. The words were uglier now, sharper. Fraud, con man, self-made, or self-deluded. The video of me walking on stage with the folder had gone viral overnight, dissected in slow motion by commentators, turned into GIFs and memes by strangers who never knew his name until that moment. His PR team scrambled, issuing a statement calling me a disgruntled former associate with a personal vendetta. They claimed the documents were fake, doctored, part of a smear campaign. But the problem was, too many people recognized those papers. Contractors began posting their own copies online. Investors shared emails. One by one, the names on those invoices came forward, voices trembling with long-buried frustration and rage. The internet turned into a courtroom, and Martin was the defendant. I should have felt triumphant watching him twist under the spotlight, and part of me did. But part of me also remembered the years I'd wasted believing his charm. The nights I'd told myself his debts weren't my problem. The moments I could have walked away and didn't. I hadn't just exposed him. I'd exposed myself too, to the guilt of silence. 2 days later, I got a call from someone I never expected. "Mr. Green?" the voice asked. It was clipped, professional, the kind of tone you only hear from people who've spent too much time in courtrooms. "This is Special Agent Wallace with the Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to speak with you about Martin Kessler." The government had noticed. When I met them, Wallace and his partner, Alvarez, they had a stack of papers almost as thick as mine. "We've had suspicions about him for a while," Alvarez admitted, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "But you just handed us the missing puzzle pieces." They wanted me to testify. They wanted me to turn over everything. And for the first time in years, I felt like maybe Martin couldn't wriggle out of this one. But Martin wasn't going quietly. 3 nights after that call, I came home to find my mailbox stuffed with an envelope. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words scrawled in thick black ink. You made a mistake. The next day, a lawyer called, claiming to represent Martin. He threatened me with a defamation suit, said I'd fabricated evidence, that Martin would ruin me financially. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. But then I thought of that note, of the way Martin's eyes had burned when he told me I'd regret this, and the laughter died in my throat. Because Martin wasn't just a fraud. He was dangerous when cornered. The conference hall was only the first battle. Now it was war, played out in court filings, headlines, and shadows. Each move I made, Martin countered. Each truth I revealed, he tried to bury under noise. But for the first time in his charmed life, the world wasn't buying the act. And I knew I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until every cent of that $1.2 million debt had a face, a name, and a story too loud for him to silence. The stage had been dramatic, but what came next would decide everything. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and nerves. Reporters packed the benches, their pens scratching furiously as the bailiff called for order. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It had become a spectacle. The trial of Martin Kessler versus the truth. He walked in flanked by his attorneys, dressed in another custom-tailored suit, though it looked more like armor than style now. He kept his chin high, but I caught the twitch in his jaw, the faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cufflinks. He still thought he could win this. He still thought charm and money could erase the mountain of evidence stacked against him. I sat at the witness table, the thick folder, now expanded into 3 binders, at my side. My stomach churned, but I refused to look away. The prosecution opened with the basics: unpaid loans, forged documents, misrepresented assets. One by one, the bills were displayed on a massive screen, each one a dagger cutting through Martin's carefully woven story. "Mr. Green," the prosecutor asked when I was called, "can you tell the court how you came into possession of these documents?" I took a breath. "Because Martin asked me to hide them," I said, my voice steady, though every eye in the room bore into me. "He knew they'd ruin him if anyone saw the extent of what he owed. He called them stepping stones. I call them lives he crushed." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Martin's attorney shot up. "Objection! Characterization!" "Overruled," the judge said, her tone flat, unmoved. I pressed on. "He didn't build an empire. He scavenged one, piece by piece from people he never paid back. He lied to banks, to investors, to friends. I should know. I was one of them." For the first time, Martin broke. He slammed his hand against the defense table, his voice cracking across the room. "You wanted in! Don't act like you're innocent! You were there! You helped me! You—" The judge's gavel banged like a gunshot. "Mr. Kessler, sit down!" But his words lingered in the air, heavy as stone. The reporter scribbled harder. The jury whispered. And I felt every eye turn to me, wondering if maybe the devil had a point. That was Martin's gift, dragging others down with him. After court adjourned for the day, I stepped outside into the blinding flash of cameras. Questions fired at me like bullets. Were you complicit? Did you profit? Why expose him now? I wanted to say everything, to lay my heart bare right there on the courthouse steps. But I knew better. "The evidence speaks for itself," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "This isn't about me. It's about the people he owes." Yet when I finally reached my car, there it was again. Another envelope on the windshield, inside a photo of my apartment door, taken from just a few feet away. My hands shook. Martin wasn't just fighting in the courtroom. He was reminding me that he still had reach, still had claws. But fear didn't outweigh fury anymore. Not after all the years I'd watched him climb over everyone else. That night, I opened the last binder, the one I hadn't shown anyone yet. It held emails, contracts, voice recordings I'd saved, even when I wasn't sure why. Now I knew. They weren't just receipts, they were weapons. And tomorrow, when the trial resumed, I planned to use every single one. because Martin had always said debts were just stepping stones. Now he was going to choke on them. The second day of trial was nothing short of a bloodletting. Martin's lawyers came out swinging, trying to paint me as the bitter ex-friend, the opportunist who turned on him when he wouldn't share the riches. "Isn't it true," one of them sneered, pacing the floor like a predator, "that you accepted money from Mr. Kessler in the past? That you willingly participated in his business practices?" "Yes," I said, my voice firm. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Yes, I helped him. At first, because I believed in him. Because he told me it was temporary, that he'd make it right. But believing someone doesn't make their crimes disappear. It makes you complicit if you stay silent. That's why I'm not silent anymore." The jurors leaned forward. Even the judge tilted her head, listening closer. The lawyer's smirk faltered. For the first time, the truth wasn't Martin's to twist. It was mine to wield. Then the prosecution dropped the real bombshell. The recordings. I'd held on to them for years, those late-night calls where Martin bragged about fooling investors, laughing about how easy it was to juggle numbers until they looked like gold. We played the first one in court, his voice dripping arrogance through the speakers. "They don't care about the truth," he said, chuckling. "They care about the show, and I give them the best damn show they've ever seen." The jury's faces hardened. The reporters' pens scratched furiously. Martin's complexion turned the color of spoiled milk. His lawyer tried to object. "Unauthorized recordings hearsay," but the judge allowed it. "Mr. Kessler's own words," she said coolly. "They'll stand." More tapes followed. Each one chipped away at the myth he'd built. By the time the third finished, the man who once commanded stages and magazine covers looked like a ghost in an expensive suit. His head hung low, his hands clenched tight, his empire collapsing in real time. But then, he tried one last card. When court recessed, he cornered me near the water fountain, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You think you've won? You don't know what you've started. You're exposing yourself, too. Every time you touch that stand, you tie yourself tighter to me." I met his eyes, steady, unflinching. "Better tied to the truth than buried under your lies." For a moment, the mask slipped completely. No charm, no grin, just raw hatred. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Security pulled him back before he could say more. But I didn't need more. I understood exactly what he meant. Martin wasn't planning to just fight in court. He was planning to burn the ground I stood on. That night, I got the call I had been dreading. Agent Wallace again. His voice was tight, controlled, but urgent. "Mr. Green, we've received credible threats. We need you under protective watch until the trial ends." Threats? From Martin? From his people? It didn't matter. I packed a bag, and before the clock struck midnight, 2 plainclothes agents escorted me to a safe house on the edge of the city. As I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressed down. This wasn't just about debts anymore. It wasn't just numbers on paper. It was about power. About a man so desperate to keep his illusion intact he'd destroy anyone who threatened it. But I wasn't backing down. Not after dragging those bills into the light. Not after hearing the chant of "pay them back" echo in my ears. The trial was far from over, but Martin Kessler was running out of stage, and I was going to make sure the final curtain fell hard. The third week of trial turned the courthouse into a war zone. The steps outside were clogged with protesters, some carrying signs that read, "Justice for the victims," others waving banners defending Martin as a visionary under attack. Camera crews jostled for angles. Every night, the trial highlights ran on national news like it was a primetime drama. Inside, though, it was no drama. It was carnage. The prosecution wheeled in witness after witness. A contractor with calloused hands, voice trembling, as he told the jury how Martin never paid him for months of work, leaving his small company bankrupt. a middle-aged couple who invested their retirement savings into one of Martin's fake ventures, now forced to live in their daughter's basement. A young woman, barely 30, who showed the jury eviction notices after Martin defaulted on promises to cover rent as part of a partnership deal. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin. I watched Martin shrink, piece by piece, into the shell of the man who once strutted past me in college bragging about believers. But Martin wasn't beaten yet. His lawyers launched a counteroffensive, filing motion after motion, demanding delays, calling every witness biased. They tried to drag me down too, hinting that maybe I had profited from Martin's schemes, that maybe I was only speaking now because the money had dried up. On cross-examination, one of them snapped, "Mr. Green, isn't it true you turned a blind eye for years while Mr. Kessler conducted his business? Doesn't that make you just as guilty?" The words cut deep because they weren't entirely wrong. I had stayed silent. I had wanted to believe Martin's lies. "Yes," I said, letting the silence stretch before adding, "I was guilty of silence, but silence ends. And if that makes me complicit, then standing here makes me something else too, accountable, which is more than Martin has ever been." The courtroom buzzed. Even the judge's stern mask cracked for half a second. The lawyer slumped back, outmaneuvered. That night, though, Martin struck back in a way I didn't expect. The news broke at midnight. Leaked emails, supposedly from me, a guy, suggesting I'd blackmailed Martin years ago for a cut of his profits. They were crude forgeries, but they spread fast. Hashtags, headlines, angry commentators demanding to know if I was the real con man behind the curtain. The agents woke me at the safe house, shoving their phones in my face. "We'll get ahead of this," Alvarez promised, her jaw set. "But you need to understand, Kessler's desperate. Desperate men don't fight clean." I couldn't sleep after that. I sat by the window, staring out at the faint glow of the city, every shadow feeling like a threat. Martin had tried charm, denial, legal intimidation, and now fabrication. What came next? The answer came the following day in court. Martin himself took the stand. He leaned into the microphone with that same smooth voice, his eyes locking on the jury, his words dripping sincerity. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he said, palms open like a preacher. "Every deal I made was with the hope of creating opportunity. Yes, mistakes were made, but I never forced anyone to invest, never forced anyone to believe in me. They chose to, because they saw potential." He paused, perfect timing, his voice softening. "And now, one man, someone I once called a friend, has twisted my journey into something ugly, but success always attracts envy. Ask yourselves, does envy look like justice?" It was a masterful performance. Even I, knowing the truth, felt the pull of his words. The jury leaned in, some nodding faintly, but then the prosecutor rose, her voice cool, surgical. "Mr. Kessler, if what you say is true, how do you explain this?" The screen lit up again. My recordings. His own laughter filled the courtroom, mocking, arrogant, undeniable. The jury's faces hardened once more. Martin's facade wavered, his mouth opening, closing, like a fish gasping for air. And I knew in that moment his stage was collapsing. But Martin was never the type to bow out quietly. He still had one more move hidden in the shadows, and deep down I could feel it coming. The only question was, would it destroy him or me? The final week of trial didn't feel like justice anymore. It felt like a siege. Every morning when I arrived under federal escort, the crowd outside was bigger, louder, split down the middle like a nation at war. On one side, victims, protesters demanding restitution, people waving copies of his invoices high in the air. On the other, loyalists, chanting Martin's name like he was some kind of folk hero, screaming that I was the Judas who sold him out. The cameras caught it all, turning every step I took into a headline. Inside the courtroom, The prosecution prepared to rest its case. They had the paper trail, the recordings, the testimonies, the victims. The jury had seen enough to convict 3 times over. Everyone could feel it. The end was near. That's when Martin made his final move. The defense called a surprise witness. My stomach twisted the moment I saw her walk through the doors. Dana, my ex. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since Martin weaseled his way between us, promising her a future of wealth and stability, while I drowned in the wreckage of his schemes. And now, there she was, taking the stand with practiced poise, eyes flicking toward me just once, cold, unreadable. The defense lawyer smiled like a shark. Ms. Hartman, can you tell the court about Mr. Green's relationship to my client? She folded her hands delicately. They were close, very close. But from the beginning, Mr. Green resented Martin's success. He told me once in private that if Martin didn't cut him in on the money, he'd destroy him. He said he'd wait for the right time to take him down. The words hit like a hammer. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled so hard their pens might have snapped. It was a lie. Every word of it. The lawyer leaned in. So, you're saying this vendetta, this entire crusade, was born out of jealousy? She nodded, lips pressed in a thin line. Yes, he hated Martin's success because it reminded him of his own failures. My pulse roared in my ears. I wanted to leap up, to shout, to tear her words apart in real time, but I forced myself to sit still, fists clenched under the table, nails digging half-moons into my palms. Losing my composure was exactly what Martin wanted. The prosecutor rose slowly, almost casually, as if she'd been waiting for this. Ms. Hartman, she said, have you ever received money from Mr. Kessler? Dana's eyes flickered just for a second. No. Are you sure? Because our records show 2 wire transfers, one for $15,000 3 months ago, and another, much larger, just last week, both directly from one of Mr. Kessler's shell accounts. The courtroom exploded. Martin's face drained of color. Dana stammered, tried to recover, but it was too late. The prosecutor slammed down copies of the bank statements. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is what desperation looks like. Bribing witnesses, manufacturing lies. If there's any doubt left in your minds about Mr. Kessler's character, let this erase it. The defense crumbled. Dana fled the stand in tears, escorted out under a barrage of camera flashes. Martin shouted about conspiracies, his voice cracking as marshals restrained him. The jury sat stone-faced, watching it all unfold. The illusion was gone. The mask had shattered. That night, back at the safe house, I sat alone in the dim light, replaying the day in my head. Martin had tried everything. Denial, intimidation, forgery, bribery. He had thrown every weapon in his arsenal. And still, the truth stood. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't finished, because Martin Kessler had built an empire out of lies. And men like him didn't know how to stop fighting, not until the very last lie collapsed on top of them. And tomorrow, the jury would decide if that collapse had finally come. The courtroom was silent when the jury filed back in. I could hear everything, the shuffle of their shoes on the polished floor, the creak of wooden benches as the gallery leaned forward, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. My chest tightened with every step they took toward their seats. Martin sat across the room, his face pale but defiant, his fingers drumming against the table in an uneven rhythm. He looked like a man daring the world to deny him, even as it closed in. The foreman stood, a folded slip of paper in his hands. The judge's voice cut through the silence, steady, deliberate. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. The paper was handed over. The judge glanced at it, then passed it back to the foreman. My breath caught in my throat. In the case of the state versus Martin Kessler, the foreman read, on the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty The word detonated in the room. Gasps, cries, the rustle of reporters fumbling for their phones. Martin flinched, just barely, before snapping his jaw shut. His mask was cracking, but he refused to let it fall. On the charge of wire fraud, guilty. On the charge of forgery, guilty. On the charge of racketeering, guilty. Each word landed heavier than the last, stacking like bricks on his shoulders. By the time the list ended, Martin wasn't a millionaire mogul anymore. He was a convicted criminal, stripped of the illusion he had spent his life performing. The judge's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Kessler, you will be remanded into custody until sentencing." For the first time, panic flickered in his eyes. He half rose from his chair, mouth open to protest, but 2 U.S. Marshals closed in, pressing him back down with firm hands. His lawyers tried to speak over the chaos, filing motions, shouting objections, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a teacup. As they dragged him past me, he turned his head sharply, eyes locking on mine. There was no charm left, no smug grin, just raw hatred, unfiltered. His lips moved, barely audible under the roar of the courtroom, but I understood. This isn't over. The reporters swarmed me outside. "How do you feel? Do you believe justice was served? What about his threats?" I should have felt victorious. I should have felt lighter, but all I felt was tired and wary. "This was never about me," I said into the cluster of microphones. "It was about the people he owed, the lives he broke along the way. Today they finally got to see the truth. That's all that matters." But as the agents hustled me into the waiting car, I couldn't shake the image of Martin's eyes burning into me as he was dragged away. At the sentencing hearing weeks later, the courtroom was packed again. Victims filled the benches, some clutching photos, others clutching hope. Martin wore a plain orange jumpsuit, his hair unkempt, his posture slouched. But even then, he tried to speak, to spin. "I built something from nothing," he said, voice ragged but determined. "I made people believe. That's not a crime, it's vision, and visionaries are always crucified." The judge wasn't moved. She handed down 30 years. The gallery erupted in cheers and sobs. Victims embraced. Reporters sprinted for the doors. And me? I just sat there, numb, staring at the man who had once convinced the world he was untouchable. As the marshals led him away, he glanced back one last time. The hatred was still there, but now it was laced with something else, fear. And I realized something then. Men like Martin never stopped scheming, even in a cell. But for the first time in his life, the stage lights were gone. The audience had turned away, and all he had left was the bill he could never pay. Still, as I walked out of the courthouse into the daylight, I couldn't shake the question lingering in my chest. Had I really finished him? Or had I just started a war that would follow me long after the gavel fell? Months passed. The noise of the trial faded into the steady hum of daily life, the headlines shifting to new scandals, new faces. But Martin lingered like a shadow at the edge of every quiet moment. I'd see him in flashes, a photograph in a newspaper clipping, shackled wrists, and hollow eyes. A passing mention on a late-night talk show, a headline about his appeals being denied. His empire had collapsed, his assets seized, his so-called loyalists scattering to save themselves. The illusion was dead, and the world had moved on. But I hadn't. The folder still sat on my desk, worn and battered, the pages inside now relics of a war I had fought and survived. Sometimes I'd open it, run my fingers over the faded invoices and angry letters, and feel the weight of all the people whose lives had been stolen by his lies. And then I'd remind myself, it wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. One evening, months after sentencing, I got a letter. The return address stopped me cold. Federal Penitentiary. My hands shook as I opened it. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. "You think you won, but walls don't last forever. And when I walk out, you'll see what a real reckoning looks like. I read it twice, then burned it in the sink. Maybe it was a threat. Maybe it was just the ranting of a man who couldn't face his fall. Either way, it no longer mattered, because Martin's stage was gone, his audience gone, his mask shattered beyond repair. What remained was me, scarred, yes, but unbroken. I'd carried the weight of his debts, his lies, his shadow for too long. And now, for the first time, I felt something I hadn't in years: freedom. I walked out onto my balcony that night, the city lights sprawling like stars beneath me. Somewhere behind bars, Martin Kessler was counting the days, clinging to whatever scraps of power he thought he still had. But out here, I was done counting. I breathed deep, the air sharp and clean, and let the final truth settle in my bones. He had called himself self-made, but in the end, the only thing Martin Kessler ever truly made was his own downfall. And I was there to hand him the bill.